High in the Spanish hills stood a monastery unlike any other, a place that demanded a tithe far darker than coins or bread. It asked for eyes, human eyes. Those who wandered too close never returned the same, and by the end of 1856, no one in the valley of Candea dared to look up at that hill. The valley itself seemed peaceful at first, draped in a pale morning mist, but above it, the monastery clung to the mountainside like the rib-cage of some long-dead giant. Its blackened stone walls were streaked with rain and age. No bell rang in its tower, no warm light flickered in its windows. Yet the villagers swore they felt a presence whenever the wind scraped against the stones, as if invisible eyes followed their every step. It began with whispers. A shepherd, trembling and pale, claimed he had passed near the monastery gates at dusk. Through the cracked iron bars, he had glimpsed the courtyard glimmering in the dying light. At first, he thought the reflections came from coins resting in shallow glass jars. But as he leaned closer, his blood turned to ice. Inside the brine, a human eye floated, unblinking, its veins red as fresh cuts. He ran without looking back, and swore never to step foot near the hill again. Weeks later, the first offering appeared in the heart of the village. On the church steps sat a small wooden alms bowl, filled not with silver, but with two human eyes suspended in cloudy water. They stared upward at the grey sky, blank yet accusing, and no villager dared to touch them. Mothers dragged their children indoors, and the priest buried the bowl in the churchyard, whispering blessings with a hand that shook. From that moment, everything changed. Doors closed earlier, windows stayed shuttered even in daylight, and when the wind howled down from the monastery, it carried with it a strange, low, wet hum, a sound that seemed to seep under the skin and into he bones. The people of Candea told themselves it was only the wind. They didn't yet understand that the monastery's harvest had just begun. Whispers consumed the valley of Candea. They coiled through the tavern, seeped into the church, and floated along the river where women washed their clothes. Every conversation, no matter how it began, ended with the same shadow on the hill, the monastery that no longer begged for coins. Its brothers roamed the valley with empty bowls, and when they returned through the iron gates, no one knew what they carried inside. Fear settled into the village like a slow sickness. Children were forbidden to play near the trees, and men avoided the pastures after dusk. It wasn't the dark they feared anymore. It was the feeling of being watched, as if the very earth had grown eyes that followed every step. One morning a woodcutter returned from the forest pale and shaking. He said he had wandered near the lower gate, where moss crept over the steps like a warning. Through a gap in the heavy doors, he had seen the courtyard again. But this time, it was different. More jars lined the walls. They were stacked against pillars and crouched in the shadows. The liquid inside yellowed like old honey. And in that thick brine, eyes drifted in slow, lazy circles. He swore one floated to the glass and pressed against it, veins splayed like roots, seeking escape. He had run until his legs failed him. Days passed before he could speak without trembling. The villagers believed him because they didn't need proof. They already felt the truth in the air. As winter crept closer, the nights grew heavier. Lanterns burned late behind shuttered windows, but their glow felt weak, swallowed by the darkness beyond. Twice, the stillness of the streets broke under the faintest sound, bare feet sliding across the cobblestones. Slow, patient. And once, the wind carried with it the soft clinking of glass, like someone gently tapping the edge of a jar. By the next dawn, the meaning became clear. Clay bowls appeared on the doorsteps of 3 homes, each filled with cloudy water, each holding a single human eye that stared up at the pale sky. The people of Candea no longer wondered if they were in danger. They only wondered how long they had before the monastery chose them. By late summer, the fear in Candea had grown so heavy it felt like an invisible fog settling over every rooftop. The streets emptied before sunset, shutters clapped shut, and even the dogs no longer barked at night. Life had shrunk to quiet movements behind locked doors. And still the villagers waited for the next sign that the monastery's shadow was reaching further into their lives. It arrived on a morning wrapped in mist. When the first villager stepped into the square, bucket in hand, he froze where he stood. The fountain, once a place where children had splashed and women gossiped, now held only cloudy brine. The water shimmered strangely, and floating on its surface were dozens of human eyes. Some were wide open and glassy, their irises catching the faint light. Others had rolled back, their red-veined whites staring skyward in mute accusation. They drifted together in lazy circles, a silent chorus of the dead. Gasps and screams rippled through the square as more villas. Gers arrived. Mothers dragged their children backward, shielding their faces. One man fell to his knees and vomited into the snow. The air seemed to grow colder as the crowd realized what had been left for them, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The priest came running, clutching his rosary with trembling hands. His voice shook as he muttered prayers and sprinkled holy water over the fountain, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was terrified. Under his instruction, the villagers drained the fountain and buried the eyes in the churchyard. Yet even as he whispered blessings over the frozen earth, the priest knew it was futile. Some sins could not be buried. The next day, the monastery made its meaning unmistakable. On the thresholds of 3 homes at the edge of the village, small clay bowls had been placed. Each was filled with cloudy brine. Each held a single human eye, floating in the water and staring at the sky. No villager dared to touch them. They only looked at one another in pale, breathless silence, because now they understood. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was ritual. And in that ritual, every eye stolen was another soul the monastery had claimed. The first disappearance came on a moonless night, when the valley lay in a darkness so complete it felt like the world had been buried. Mateo Ruiz lived in the last house before the forest climbed toward the monastery. He, his wife, and their little daughter had spent the evening huddled by the fire, whispering prayers they no longer believed could protect them. Outside, the wind carried a strange, low hum, soft and wet, like water moving deep beneath the earth. The dogs whined. The chickens refused to leave their roost. And somewhere above, the monastery waited, silent and patient. By morning, the Ruiz home stood open to the cold. The door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Chairs were overturned. Ashes glowed faintly in the hearth. The place looked as if life had been peeled away in the night, leaving only the shell of a home behind. On the kitchen table rested a single clay bowl. Its water was cloudy and trembling in the draught. Inside floated 2 human eyes, one small and brown, the other milky with age. They stared upward at the rafters, seeing nothing, yet somehow accusing the world that had failed to protect them. Mateo, his wife, and their daughter were gone. The villagers gathered outside, too afraid to enter. The air felt thick and wrong, as if the house itself knew what had happened. The priest arrived last, pale and shaking. He whispered a blessing, though his voice cracked before the final word left his lips. Then he shut the door and turned his face to the ground. No prayer could erase what had taken place there. That night, the monastery bell tolled for the first time in decades. Its sound rolled down the hills, low and mournful, a vibration that seemed to shake the very bones of the valley. No one spoke. No one moved. Every soul in Candea understood the meaning. The monks were marking their harvest. For 3 nights, the village held its breath. Lant. Urns flickered weakly behind shuttered windows. Children cried softly in their mothers' arms. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind against the shutters felt like a whisper from the hill. And when the 4th dawn came, another house stood open to the snow, another bowl waited on the table, and the valley understood the truth. The monastery would not stop until it had taken everything. By the time the 2nd family vanished, Fear in Candea had hardened into something heavier than panic. It was a sickness that seeped into the walls and into the bones of the few villagers who remained. Children were locked away before sunset, shutters nailed closed, and fires burned low, as if even light might attract unwanted attention. Life had narrowed to survival, and yet the sense of being watched never lifted. The path to the monastery grew wild with weeds and ice, as if the earth itself had stopped carrying footsteps toward that cursed place. And still, the villagers felt its presence. Some nights, the wind carried the faint clinking of glass down from the hill. Other nights, there came a wet, droning hum, low and rhythmic, that slipped through the cracks of doors and into the dreams of those still trapped in the valley. Then, the storm arrived. Rain and sleet swept through the mountains, hammering the roofs and flooding the paths. Thunder cracked like a warning, and lightning revealed a sight that froze the villagers in place. Figures moved through the streets, robed in black, their garments plastered to their bodies by the downpour. Each one cradled a glass jar that glimmered whenever the lightning flashed, like pale lanterns in the night. None of them hurried. None of them stumbled. They moved with the patience of something that had already claimed the valley as its own. When the storm passed, the village trembled under its aftermath. Along the main road, 3 clay bowls sat half buried in the mud, their water trembling in the cold air. In each floated a single human eye, its color still bright, its veins raw as if plucked from the living only hours before. None of the eyes belonged to the missing families. The priest understood the message, and so did the villagers. The monastery was no longer just taking, it was warning. That night, the priest gathered the survivors in the church. His voice shook as he spoke of penance and curses, of sins older than any of them could remember. But the people were no longer listening. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted escape. Yet escape was a dream. The river swelled with the storm, and the mountain passes were swallowed by mist. Even if they tried to flee, they would only walk into the arms of the monastery. And as night fell, the bell tolled again. Slow, heavy, inevitable. By the first frost of 1856, Candea no longer felt like a village. Half the homes stood empty, their doors swinging in the wind, meals left to rot on tables. The few remaining families moved through the streets like ghosts, their footsteps soft, their voices little more than whispers. The valley had grown quiet, and in that quiet, fear became a living thing. The exodus began without a word. Tea. Woe brothers slipped away at dusk, guiding a single mule toward the mountains. A week later, an entire family vanished, leaving only a locked door and a trail of footprints that ended in the mist. By the end of the month, nearly half of Candea had fled into the wilderness, carrying nothing but bread, water, and trembling children. But the monastery's reach extended beyond the village. Travelers who skirted the surrounding forest told unsettling stories. They spoke of dark-robed figures gliding silently among the trees, jars cradled in their pale hands, the glass catching even the weakest light. One shepherd swore he found a shattered jar on the rocky path, its brine soaking into the dirt. Inside lay a single human eye, still wet, staring up at the sky as if waiting to be claimed again. Back in the valley, nature itself seemed to recoil. Birds no longer sang near the river. The air carried a metallic tang, sharp as rusted iron, and the monastery loomed above it all, silent and patient. Its empty windows resembled black eye sockets, watching the hollowed streets below. On the coldest nights, the wind carried a murmur of chanting down into the village. Slow, wet, and rhythmic, it slithered beneath doors and coiled in the rafters. The words were foreign, but the intent was clear. It was a ritual, and with every passing day, the people of Candea felt their lives being measured, as if the valley itself had decided who would vanish next. By the time the first snows fell, The villagers understood a new and terrible truth. The monastery no longer needed to walk among them to claim its harvest. Its shadow had slipped into their homes, into their sleep, into the very air they breathed. The valley did not belong to the living anymore. It belonged to the watching dead. By midwinter, Candea had become a memory of itself. Snow smothered the streets, softening the edges of the abandoned homes, and every sound seemed to die before it could cross the square. Only a handful of families remained, and they moved like shadows, their faces hollow with sleeplessness. The village no longer felt like a place where life could exist. It felt like a stage where something unseen waited for its final act. At night, the survivors heard soft scraping on stone, bare feet sliding through the streets, unhurried and patient. Sometimes the wind carried the delicate clinking of glass, a sound so faint they wondered if it came from inside their own heads. No one dared open a door or pull aside a shutter. They didn't need to. In their minds they could already see the robed figures gliding through the snow, jars cradled in their pale hands, moving as if guided by a ritual older than the hills themselves. Then, one morning, the monastery made its presence undeniable. The villagers awoke to find the churchyard transformed. Along the cold stone wall, dozens of glass jars had been arranged in a perfect silent line. Frost clung to their sides, and inside each floated a human E. Yeah, some half-lidded, others staring wide into the pale sky. The veins within them glowed faintly in the morning light, like red cracks in porcelain. One villager swore that as he stepped into the yard, the eyes shifted in their jars, turning toward him in lazy, liquid motion. The priest crept forward, trembling, his breath fogging the frozen air. He reached for the nearest jar, intending to remove it, to cleanse the ground of this blasphemy. But before his fingers could touch the glass, the wind carried a low, wet hum down from the hill. He froze where he stood. No one had to say a word. They all backed away, leaving the jars untouched. And by the next morning, they were gone. Only their round impressions in the snow remained, as if the land itself remembered where they had been. From that day forward, the last families of Candea knew they were not just being hunted. They were living inside the monastery's ritual, and every moment they stayed was an invitation to be taken next. The first night of February fell heavy over Candea, blanketing the valley in a stillness so deep it felt unnatural. The last surviving families huddled inside their homes, lanterns flickering weakly against the frost, creeping down the windows. Outside, the snow glittered beneath a thin, distant moon, and the air was so still that each breath sounded like a trespass. No one spoke. No one dared to sleep. Every ear strained against the silence, waiting for the sound that had haunted their dreams. It came just before midnight. The monastery bell tolled. Its voice rolled down the hill like a wave of iron and grief, slow and heavy, rattling window panes and sending a shiver through the beams of every home. The first toll froze the survivors where they sat. The second hollowed out their hearts. The third made the smallest children whimper as their mothers pressed hands over their ears. No one had to say what it meant. The bell was not a call to prayer. It was a funeral song for the living. At dawn, the village learned whose death it marked. On the far edge of Candea, the home of old Mara and her young grandson stood with its door ajar. Snow had drifted across the threshold, and the wind toyed with a curtain like a playful ghost. Inside, chairs were overturned, ashes still smouldered in the hearth, and on the table sat a single clay bowl. Its brine trembled in the draught. Floating inside were two human eyes, one clouded with age, the other small and bright, both staring upward in mute accusation. The priest whispered blessings that tasted like ash in his mouth. He knew prayers could not reach where the monastery had taken them. That night, the bell tolled again. Its voice was slower this time, deeper, as if the hill itself had a heartbeat. Through the narrow cracks of shutters, the remaining families saw small glimmers moving in the mist. They weren't lanterns. They were reflected. Sends the light of the moon glancing off jars cradled in pale hands, drifting down into the village. By morning, another home was empty. Another bowl waited on a table, and the message was clear. The monastery would keep tolling its bell until the valley had no one left to hear it. By the second week of February, Candea was no longer a village. It was a hollow shell, a cluster of snow-covered homes that felt more like gravestones than shelter. Smoke rose from only a single chimney, and even that flickered out by nightfall. The streets, buried in frost, echoed with nothing but the wind. Every survivor moved as if walking through a dream, speaking to no one, daring to hope for nothing. Then, one night, the bell tolled. Its voice rolled through the valley, deep and slow, each vibration crawling across the snow and through the bones of the last living villagers. The first toll stopped their hearts, the second filled their chests with ice, and the third reminded them that they were only waiting to be chosen. The next morning, the proof was there. Bare footprints wound through the streets, weaving in circles and loops, touching every door that still held life. They ended at the fountain, where 3 clay bowls sat in a perfect line. Each held a single human eye, bloodshot and wet, staring at the sky as if in silent witness. The priest's house stood open. Inside, the fire was cold, the bed still warm, and the priest himself was gone, taken without a sound. A clay bowl sat on his table too, its water trembling in the draught, the eye inside still so fresh it seemed alive. Whatever blessing he had whispered last had not been heard. By that evening, no smoke rose from any chimney. The remaining families had vanished. The wind wandered through empty streets, brushing against broken shutters and whispering through gaps in the doors. Snow covered the last footprints, softening the evidence of lives erased. Above it all, the monastery loomed in perfect stillness. Its windows were dark and hollow, resembling black, unblinking eyes. The bell did not ring that night. It didn't need to. Its work was done. Candea belonged to the dead now. The valley lay in perfect, suffocating silence. And high above, the monastery watched. When the last sounds of life faded from Candea, the valley became a grave. Snow draped over the abandoned homes like a burial shroud, softening their shapes until they looked like slumped, forgotten stones. Doors swung gently in the wind, curtains drifted in broken windows, and the only movement came from the black birds circling above. For 3 days the village sat untouched, and the monastery loomed over it like a predator that had already fed. On the 4th morning, a single figure emerged from the tree line. Alonso, the woodcutter, had been hiding in the surrounding hills for weeks, surviving on snowmelt and bitter roots. He had fled when the bell first tolled, but the silence that followed became unbearable. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes, no matter how it burned into his memory. The climb up the hill was slow and brutal. His boots crunched in the snow, and each step carried the weight of dread. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and with every gust of wind came a faint smell of brine and decay. When the iron gates of the monastery came into view, Alonso stopped. They hung wide open, rusted and crooked, as though waiting for him to enter. The courtyard was a nightmare made real. Rows of glass jars lined the walls and lay half buried in the snow. The liquid inside had turned yellow and thick, and the eyes within floated in slow, lazy spirals. Some faced the sky, catching the dim light, their irises still sharp and clear. Others bobbed sideways or upside down, their veins pale and brittle, as if frozen in time. Alonso's stomach twisted, but he stepped deeper into the courtyard. Each footfall was deafening against the silence. He could feel the weight of 100 unblinking witnesses pressing against his skin. Then he saw the altar. At the center of the open cloister, beneath the broken roof, sat a single wooden alms bowl. Its water was clear and still. Floating in it were 2 fresh eyes, bright with color and veined with life. Alonso's breath caught. Someone had been taken after the valley fell silent, and from somewhere deep inside the monastery, a soft splash echoed, rippling through the cold air. Alonso froze. He wasn't alone. Alonso crouched behind a crumbling column, his chest heaving in the frozen air. The soft splash echoed again, deeper this time, and in the silence that followed, he heard it. Bare feet on stone. Slow. Wet. Deliberate. The sound crawled up his spine like an ice-cold finger. He tightened his grip on the small axe in his hands, though he already knew it would be as useless as a twig against whatever lived here. From the far end of the cloister, a figure emerged. A monk draped in a black robe that hung heavy with moisture glided into the courtyard. Its hood sagged low, casting its face into shadow. In its hands, it cradled a glass jar, the size of a human head, filled with cloudy brine. Inside floated a single human eye, its bloodshot iris drifting lazily until it seemed to lock on Alonso's hiding place. The monk moved slowly, each step soft and deliberate. When it reached the wall, it lifted the jar with careful, ritualistic precision and set it onto a stone ledge. A second sound followed, the faint clinking of glass. Alonso turned his head toward the archway and saw another monk emerge, taller, carrying 2 jars in a rope sling. The liquid inside trembled with every step, and in the shifting reflections, he saw multiple irises catching the dim light. Alonso pressed himself tighter against the column, trying not to breathe. His heart thundered in his ears. Then the first monk turned its hood toward him. A slow, deliberate motion. Beneath the hood, there were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale flesh glistening in the cold light, like wet wax stretched over bone. And yet, Alonso felt its gaze pierce him, sharp as a needle sliding into his thoughts. He realized the truth in that instant. The monks saw through the stolen eyes in their jars. A single drop of icy water fell from the broken archway onto his neck, and he flinched. The hum began. Low at first, then rising in a wet, resonant vibration that seemed to fill the stone itself. The jars on the walls quivered, and the eyes inside began to turn in unison, all drifting toward the source of the hum. Toward him. Then, from behind, another set of footsteps approached, soft and wet, closing in. Alonso's back, pressed against the cold stone, his breath caught in his throat. The soft footsteps closed in from behind, joined by the faint, rhythmic clinking of glass. He dared a slow glance over his shoulder, and his blood turned to ice. Another monk glided into view, taller than the rest, carrying 3 glass jars in a rope sling, each one swaying with a dull shimmer. In the murky liquid, eyes floated and rolled, catching threads of moonlight, as if they were alive even in death. The monks moved with deliberate, ritualistic precision, gliding to the center of the nave. Alonso watched as the first monk approached the baptismal font, its pale hands trembling slightly as it dipped a long, waxy finger into the cloudy water. The single eye that already floated there spun in slow circles, as if awakened by the touch. Then the monk lifted its jar and poured the contents into the font. Another eye slipped beneath the surface, trailing its red veins like roots sinking into soil. The hum swelled. From the shadows, more monks emerged, each bearing a jar, moving in an unbroken circle around the font. The brine began to churn on its own, and the eyes inside drifted toward one another, turning and spinning like they were bound to an unseen current. The air filled with the scent of salt and rot, and the sound of the hum vibrated in Alonso's chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, a new jar caught his attention. A monk cradled it close to its chest, and inside floated 2 small eyes, child's eyes, impossibly bright in the yellowed brine. Alonso felt bile rise in his throat. The moment the monk poured them into the font, all the other eyes turned toward them, as though greeting the newest additions to their congregation. The ritual deepened. The monk swayed. Their featureless faces tilted toward the ceiling as the hum rose to a sharp, wet resonance that made the stone tremble. Alonso felt a pressure building behind his own eyes, an ache that pulsed with every vibration of the sound. And in that moment he understood the horror. These monks didn't just steal eyes for trophies. They saw through them, living vision through the brine, through the countless souls they had claimed. The hum rose higher, the water spun faster, and for the first time Alonso felt the ritual reaching for him. Alonso's muscles finally obeyed the terror flooding his body. He lunged from behind the altar and bolted across the cold stone floor, his boots slipping on patches of frost. Behind him, the monastery erupted to life. The low hum became a vibrating roar, echoing off the cloister walls like the voice of the mountain itself. Glass clinked in rapid succession, footsteps slapped against stone, and the jars rattled as if eager to leap from their ledges. He ran through the courtyard, heart hammering so hard it blurred his vision. He leapt over a fallen jar, its brine spilling into the snow, and caught a glimpse of a single human eye rolling toward him, glistening under the moonlight as if following his escape. He didn't dare slow down. Behind him, the monks poured from the shadows in numbers he couldn't comprehend. Their robes whispered against the snow, moving faster than he thought possible. Some carried jars that gleamed like pale lanterns, and others carried nothing at all, their featureless faces tilting upward to catch the wind as if they could smell his fear. The hum shifted into a pattern that pulsed inside his chest, a rhythm his own heartbeat began to match. Alonso's boots hit the slope of the hill, and he half ran, half slid down toward the silent village below. Branches whipped his arms as he stumbled through the tree line, snow flying in his wake. For a moment, he dared to believe he might make it, until a glimmer caught his eye in the darkness. Between the trees, tiny reflections moved with him, like the glass jars were chasing through the forest, gliding on invisible hands. Halfway down, his foot caught a hidden root, and he crashed into the snow. His axe spun out of reach. The world tilted, and for a heartbeat, he could hear nothing but the pound of his own pulse. Then came the sound he feared most, a single, deliberate clink of glass, impossibly close. Alonso forced himself onto his knees and looked back. At the monastery gate high above, a monk stood perfectly still, holding a jar high over its head like an offering to the valley. Inside, a single fresh green eye floated, catching the moonlight. Alonso's blood turned to ice as he realized it was staring directly at him. He stumbled to his feet and ran, knowing he could leave the hill behind, but never its gaze. Alonso stumbled into the abandoned streets of Candea as the last light of day bled into the snow. His chest burned and his legs shook with exhaustion, but he could not stop. The village, once alive with laughter and the clatter of hooves, now felt like a hollow grave. Snow muffled his footsteps, swallowing the only sign that a living soul remained. He leaned against a wall to catch his breath and listened. The silence was absolute, yet it felt heavy, as if the air itself were watching him. Even without glancing back, he felt the monastery on the hill looming over the valley, its invisible reach stretching into the streets like a hand he could not escape. Moving cautiously, he passed the darkened windows of empty homes. Inside, tables still held rotting meals, and chairs lay toppled as if the families had vanished mid-motion. Each step Alonso took felt like trespassing through the last breaths of the dead. Then he saw it, a clay alms bowl half buried in snow near the old tavern. Its water had not frozen despite the biting cold, and floating in the brine were two human eyes, the irises sharp against the pale landscape, veins red as tiny rivers. Alonso's stomach twisted. He knew those eyes. Their pale blue color matched Mateo Ruiz, the first man taken from the valley. He staggered back, and that's when he noticed more. Another bowl rested near the well, another on the church steps, and another, forming a silent procession through the snow-covered street. Each one was filled with brine and a single unblinking eye, as if the monastery had extended its ritual into the village itself. The wind shifted, and a familiar hum slid between the homes, low and wet, curling around the corners like smoke. Alonso's head jerked toward the slope, and his blood ran cold. Glimmers moved in the mist, descending the hill in slow, deliberate rhythm. At first he thought they were lanterns. Then the light caught just right, and he understood. They were reflections from the jars, carried in pale, patient hands. The monastery was no longer confined to its walls. As the hum swelled, Alonso realized the village he had fled to was already claimed, and there was nowhere left to hide. Alonso shoved open the church doors, and the heavy wood groaned like a dying animal. Inside, the air was colder than the night outside, thick with the scent of damp stone, old ashes, and the faint metallic tang of decay. Shadows stretched across the empty pews where the last villagers had once knelt, whispering prayers that had gone unanswered. The church no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb. He moved down the central aisle, boots echoing softly against the cracked floor, his breath a trembling cloud in the air. At the altar, the baptismal font caught his eye. Its water was cloudy, and in that pale liquid floated a single human eye, its iris pale and lifeless, staring at the vaulted ceiling as if begging heaven for help. Alonso turned away quickly, bile rising in his throat. Even sacred ground had been claimed by the monastery. He crouched behind the altar, pressing his back to the cold stone, listening. Through a narrow window, he could see the hill rising beyond the village. Glimmers drifted through the fog, weaving slowly down the slope. They were not lanterns. They were reflections, moonlight bouncing off the jars cradled in pale hands. The monastery was coming. Then a soft knock broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. Alonso froze. The sound was so gentle it might have been polite, but it carried the weight of death behind it. A second knock followed, then the faint clinking of glass against stone, patient and deliberate. He could almost picture it. A monk standing just outside, jar in hand, waiting for him to open the door. Tea. He wind shifted and a low, wet hum seeped through the gaps in the wood, slithering across the floorboards and into his bones. Alonso pressed himself tighter to the altar, but the sound seemed to crawl under his skin, vibrating in his chest. He felt it in his teeth. He felt it behind his eyes. Then he heard water trickling above him, though no rain fell outside. The ceiling dripped, as if the very walls were sweating. A cold realization struck him. The monastery wasn't just outside. It had followed him into the church. Another knock echoed through the nave, soft and patient, and Alonso understood. No door could keep this horror out. The soft knock faded into silence, but the weight of it lingered in Alonso's chest. He crouched behind the altar, his fingers clenching the handle of his small axe, though he knew it would do nothing against the thing that waited beyond the door. Then came the sound he feared most, the slow, deliberate clinking of glass moving along the church walls outside, circling him like a predator. Through a slit in the window, he caught a glimpse of movement. Dozens of robed figures drifted across the snow, their silhouettes dark against the pale mist. Some carried glass jars that shimmered faintly in the moonlight, while others moved empty-handed, their hoods drooping low over faces he could not see, but felt. The valley seemed to hold its breath as the line of monks approached the church, silent but inevitable. Then the door began to move. It didn't slam open. It didn't break. It simply swung inward with slow, patient ease, as if invited by the air itself. A cold draught swept through the nave, carrying the smell of brine and old stone, and the candles guttered against it. Alonso pressed his back tighter against the altar, his breath shallow, his heart pounding so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The first wet footstep landed on the wooden floor, then another, then another. Alonso bit down on his tongue to keep from making a sound. Through a gap in the altar's side, he saw a monk glide past the pews. Its hood sagged low, and in its pale, almost luminous hands, it carried a large glass jar. Inside, a single human eye floated in cloudy brine, spinning lazily as if alive. The monk stopped near the baptismal font. The hum began, low at first, then vibrating through the stone like the heartbeat of the building itself. The wooden pews groaned, and droplets rolled down the cold walls, making the church feel like it was sweating in fear. Shadows moved along the floor as more monks slipped inside, their jars clinking in rhythm with the hum. Alonso dared not breathe. He realized with a chill that froze his spine. He was surrounded, and the church, which once promised salvation, had become an extension of the monastery's ritual. Alonso pressed himself into the cold stone of the altar, his breath shallow, his chest tight. He dared to peek around the edge, and what he saw turned his blood to ice. The monks had gathered around the baptismal font, forming a silent circle. Each one carried a glass jar, their pale hands trembling slightly, as they moved in a ritual that felt older than the stones beneath them. The brine in the font trembled before a single drop touched it, as if it already knew what was coming. The first monk extended a long, waxy finger and swirled the cloudy water. The single eye, already floating inside, spun in place, the veins in its sclera twitching like living threads. Then, with slow reverence, the monk tilted its jar. A fresh human eye slid into the font, rippling the surface. Its iris was bright green, the veins trailing behind it like roots reaching for the bottom. The hum rose from deep in their throats, a wet, resonant sound that vibrated through the stone and into Alonso's chest. More monks stepped forward, pouring their jars into the font. One by one the eyes joined the swirling current, until dozens of irises drifted together, turning lazily before spinning apart. Then came the jar that made Alonso's stomach twist in on itself. A monk cradled it as though it held the most sacred relic in the world. Inside floated two small eyes, impossibly bright, unmistakably a child's. As they entered the water, every other eye in the font turned toward them as if acknowledging a new soul in their macabre congregation. The hum deepened, and the ritual grew more intense. The monks swayed, their blank, featureless faces tilting toward the ceiling. Alonso felt a pressure blooming behind his own eyes, sharp and insistent, as though the ritual were pulling at his very vision. He understood now. The monks didn't need their own eyes. They saw through the stolen ones, living their eternal life in the brine, tethered to the souls they had claimed. The water in the font began to swirl faster, and the air grew thick with the scent of salt and rot. Alonso felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the truth settled over him like a shroud. He had not come as a witness. He had come as the next offering. Alonso's body trembled as the ritual consumed the church. The low hum seeped into his bones, vibrating through his chest until his own heartbeat seemed to follow its rhythm. The pressure behind his eyes sharpened into pain, a stabbing ache that made it hard to think. He clutched his face, teeth clenched, but the agony only deepened, pulsing with every rise and fall of the monks' voices. Then the tallest monk approached the font, moving with glacial reverence. In its hands, it carried a single glass jar, larger than the rest. Inside floated a fresh green eye, gleaming in the candlelight. Alonso's stomach dropped into ice. He recognized it instantly. It was his wife's eye. A silent scream caught in his throat. Rage, grief, and terror collided inside him, but his body was no longer his own. He could not lunge, could not strike, could not even weep. The hum pinned him to the stone floor as surely as iron chains. The monk, too, ipped the jar, and the eye slipped into the font with a soft, wet splash. At that moment, Alonso's pain became unbearable. A white-hot stab shot through his skull as blood welled behind his eyes, spilling in warm streams down his cheeks. His vision blurred, and for a moment the world disappeared. Then he saw again, but from somewhere else. The church unfolded before him from dozens of angles at once. He saw the monks swaying in their circle, featureless hoods tilting in unison. He saw himself on the floor, a trembling figure with blood streaking his face. He saw the font. now swirling with a storm of eyes, each one staring, each one alive. The voices were not just hums anymore. They were inside his mind, whispering in unison, soft and wet. "Join us." The pressure intensified, as if invisible hands were digging into his skull from the inside. His body convulsed, his nails scraping the cold stone. He tasted salt and copper as blood slid into his mouth. Every instinct begged him to resist, to hold on to himself, but the ritual was stronger. The last thing Alonso saw with his own eyes was the font, glowing faintly in the dark, and the reflection of his face among the floating dead. Alonso's scream shattered the silence of the church, echoing against the stone before being swallowed by the hum. The pressure behind his eyes reached a breaking point, a molten, tearing pain that felt as if his very soul was being pulled through the sockets. He collapsed onto his side, blood spilling warm down his cheeks, mixing with the cold sweat that drenched his skin. Each heartbeat was a hammer blow, and with every pulse, the world dimmed further. Then came the first wet plop. Alonso didn't need to see to know what had happened. One of his eyes had left him. His mouth opened in a silent gasp as the monks swayed in unison, their hum resonating in the floor beneath him like a second heartbeat. A moment later, the second plop followed, and darkness took him completely. But the darkness did not last. Vision bloomed from everywhere at once. He saw the church from angles impossible for a man. From the font, from the jars lining the walls, from the dozens of floating eyes that had witnessed countless deaths. He saw himself as a broken shell on the floor, blood running from empty sockets, trembling in the candlelight. He saw the monks, featureless hoods swaying, their pale hands lifted as though in worship. A terrible understanding seeped into his mind. He was no longer just a man. His consciousness had been pulled into the monastery's collective sight. He could feel the cold embrace of the brine, the way it cradled countless other eyes that hummed with a single unified thought. He was part of the ritual now. The monks lifted his limp body with ritualistic care, their touch damp and cold, and carried him out into the courtyard. He felt the air shift as the wind bit at his face. Somewhere glass clinked, and he understood what came next. He was lowered into a jar. He felt the cold brine crawl over his skin, seeping into every pore, making him weightless. He could no longer move. He didn't need to. He could see everything: the monastery walls, the empty valley, the snow-covered streets of Candea, all from inside his new prison. And around him, dozens of other jars hummed softly, their eyes fixed on the world with eternal patience. Alonso's last human thought was not a scream. It was acceptance. He was just another eye in the monastery's endless collection. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy shroud, and Candea became a village of ghosts. Snow swallowed the streets and drifted high against the doors of empty homes. The wind slid through broken shutters and open thresholds, carrying with it a hollow moan that seemed to echo the valley's loss. The living were gone, leaving behind a place that no longer belonged to them. From the distance, the village appeared almost peaceful, a painting of stillness and white silence. But anyone who wandered closer felt it immediately, the weight of the valley's memory pressing down on the chest like a cold hand. Every step stirred an awareness that eyes were on them, though the windows were empty and the streets deserted. For weeks the village lay untouched. Then spring thawed the snow and the truth surfaced. Clay bowls emerged from the mud, their brine long evaporated, leaving behind the blackened remains of human eyes. Some were collapsed in on themselves, shriveled and brittle. Others, impossibly, still held shape, staring sightlessly at the grey sky, as if the last thing they had seen had frozen in them forever. The church doors swayed with the wind, groaning as if mourning the lives they had failed to protect. Inside, the altar was bare, the air heavy and still. The baptismal font held only a ring of salt and rust, and yet stepping inside felt like entering a space that was not empty at all. It was crowded with something unseen, a presence that never blinked. By the time summer came, nature had begun to reclaim the valley. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, grass pushed through the cobblestones, and birds perched briefly on the rooftops. Yet the place did not feel alive. It felt like the earth itself had absorbed the monastery's patience, waiting for new eyes to open. The nearby towns whispered the story in fragments. They warned travelers to avoid the valley, to never follow the mist into that hollow place. Some swore that on nights when the fog rolled low, the wind carried a soft hum that made the skin crawl, a sound that seemed to come from the hill itself. Because though the village was gone, the monastery still waited, and it would wait for as long as it took. By the dawn of the 20th century, Candea was little more than a whisper on old maps. The roads had shifted, the living had long abandoned it, and the valley itself had become a blank space in memory. Only the nearby towns kept its story alive, muttering the name that no traveller could forget once heard, La Loma de los Ojos, the Hill of Eyes. In 1912, 3 men followed a faded Roman path into the forgotten valley. They expected nothing more than ruins. What they found was a place preserved by absence, a village that looked as though it had simply paused, waiting for life to return. Snow lay in perfect sheets across the streets, unbroken by human footprints. Doors hung ajar. Homes sat still with rotting wooden plates and dust-covered chairs, as if the families had only stepped out for a moment that never ended. The air was unnervingly cold for the season. One of the men, a local guide, swore it felt thick, like it carried a weight. In the silence, he said, he could feel something measuring him, an awareness that made his skin prickle. He refused to step inside the houses, claiming the windows reflected more than the snow outside. Curiosity, however, drew them up the hill to the monastery. The iron gates sagged on their hinges, still yawning open, as they had the night the valley died. Inside, the courtyard lay half buried in frost, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, like wet iron and old salt. Along the cracked stone walls, glass jars still lingered, some shattered, some whole. A few still held their cargo, pale, soft spheres drifting in yellowed water, irises dull but unblinking. One man lifted a lantern toward a jar. For a moment, the light caught the surface of an eye, and he swore he saw the iris twitch, ever so slightly, turning to meet his gaze. That night, only 2 men returned to the nearby town. The third had stayed behind, last seen walking slowly toward the broken cloister, lantern swinging in the mist. They searched, calling his name until their voices cracked, but the monastery offered no answer. And as the fog rolled down the hill, one of the men swore he saw a pale, featureless face in the monastery window, watching and waiting. By the 1930s, the legend of La Loma de los Ojos had grown roots beyond the nearby towns. To the locals, the valley was no longer a village, or even a ruin. It was living cursed ground, a place they said had learned to watch. Travelers who wandered too close were met not with hostility, but with silence that pressed on the chest like a cold weight, warning them to leave. Animals were the first to obey that warning. Hunters claimed their dogs would not step past the tree line, whining and pawing at the earth, refusing to be dragged forward. Horses snorted and balked at the valley's edge, turning in circles as if trying to flee an invisible hand. Even the crows that circled overhead avoided the rooftops, veering away as if some unseen force pushed them back. Nature itself seemed to recoil from the hill. Grass grew thin and yellow where it should have thrived. The trees along the slope leaned outward, their twisted branches reaching away from the monastery like they feared to touch its shadow. No flowers bloomed there, even in spring. It was a valley left to rot under the weight of its own memory. Yet some people still ignored the warnings. Those who entered returned with the same stories. They spoke of a prickling awareness that crawled along the spine, a sense that eyes were following them, though every wind. Our was black and empty. Some swore they felt their heartbeat slow, as though the valley itself was testing them, deciding whether to let them leave. A shepherd once found a half-buried bowl near the frozen fountain. Its brine had long dried to salt, leaving a shrunken, blackened eye staring skyward. Another traveller claimed he heard a soft splash behind him while walking through the square, though there was no water left in the village. He fled without looking back, certain he had been measured and dismissed. By the end of the decade, the townspeople spoke of the fog that rolled from the hill as the monastery's breath. They claimed that when it reached the edge of their fields, livestock vanished in the night, and the mornings carried an eerie stillness, as if the valley had leaned closer to listen. No one dared enter after dark, and when the wind carried the faint clinking of glass down from the hill, doors closed, shutters latched, and every head bowed. Because those who met its gaze did not always come back. By the 1970s, La Loma de los Ojos had drifted from whispered legend into the world of thrill-seekers and amateur ghost hunters. The old warnings were treated like local folklore, the kind meant to sell stories in roadside taverns. Young men with cameras and tape recorders came to the valley, grinning as they filmed its empty streets, joking into their microphones to mask the unease that crept in with every step. In the daylight, the village felt frozen in time. Doors gaped open, and snow drifted across the stone floors of homes where meals had rotted to dust. Wind rattled loose shutters and whistled through the cracks, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and rusted iron. They captured it all on film, narrating in a tone that was equal parts fascination and nervous laughter. But as the sun slid behind the hill, the mood changed. Shadows stretched long, and the white silence of the valley felt heavier, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Their voices grew softer. The crunch of their boots on the frost seemed too loud, echoing off the walls of abandoned homes. In the church, one man lifted his camera toward the altar. The baptismal font was rimmed with salt, a faint reddish stain clinging to the stone. He joked about baptizing the camera for good luck, his voice shaking in the cold air. Later, when the tape was played back, that joke was there. But so was something else, buried beneath it. A low, wet hum, faint but steady, like a heartbeat pulsing in the walls. Night fell as they climbed toward the monastery. Their flashlights cut through the mist, revealing the courtyard half swallowed by weeds and snow. Glass jars still lingered against the walls, some shattered, others intact, their yellowed brine holding the pale shapes of human eyes. One of the men shined his beam on a jar, and the reflection seemed to move, as though the eye inside had turned to full. "Lo him!" Panic spread quickly. They ran, slipping and stumbling down the hill, their laughter gone, replaced by shouts and the clatter of boots on stone. Only two made it back to the van. The third man's camera was found days later in the snow near the gate. Its final frame showed the monastery in the mist, and in its shadow, dozens of faint, glimmering reflections, eyes floating where no bodies stood. By the early 2000s, La Loma de los Ojos had become a curiosity for the digital age. Online forums and grainy videos labeled it Spain's Forgotten Valley, or The Monastery That Watches. Urban explorers arrived with smartphones, camcorders and drones, convinced that modern technology could capture what folklore had feared for generations. In daylight, they wandered the village like tourists in a frozen world. They filmed the snow-dusted streets, the ivy-choked windows, the church with its doors yawning wide. They cracked nervous jokes to fill the silence, claiming the place was nothing but a relic of old superstitions. But every time the wind moved through the valley, their voices lowered, and their smiles faltered. Some left before dusk, their footage showing nothing unusual beyond the haunting stillness of abandonment. Others stayed longer, hungry for proof. They walked to the fountain, brushing snow from the rim, and claimed they saw dark stains in the stone, like rings left behind by water that had held something far worse. Those who dared to climb the hill rarely returned the same. One hiker, a solo traveler with a camera strapped to his chest, described the sensation as walking into a trap that could breathe. He said the fog swallowed sound, leaving him with only the faint clinking of glass that came and went with the wind. His final video showed him entering the courtyard of the monastery, his light passing over rows of broken jars, their fragments glittering like teeth. Then as he turned, a reflection appeared in the lens, a single wet eye glinting in the dark. Weeks later, his camera was found at the valley's edge, the battery dead, the lens cracked. He never claimed it. He never returned. Locals began to believe that the monastery had adapted to the modern age. Electronics failed near the hill, footage went missing, and devices that worked elsewhere would die the moment explorers entered the courtyard. Some said the monastery didn't want to be filmed, that it didn't need to be seen to remember every face that entered, and when the fog crawled down the hill at night, dotted with faint glimmers that were not lanterns, even the bravest hikers turned away, because once the monastery saw you, it never forgot. Today, the valley of Candea lies buried in fog and silence, a place that feels less like land and more like a memory that refuses to fade. The village slumps beneath the weight of time, its doors open to the wind, its roofs sagging under the embrace of ivy and moss. Snow drifts into its empty homes, and the wind moves through its streets like a slow breath, as if the earth itself still remembers what happened here. The monastery remains the only true sentinel. It clings to the hill like a blackened ribcage, its windows gaping as hollow as sockets without eyes. No bell rings now, no prayers rise from the nave. Yet anyone who wanders near feels the same pressure, that quiet and unmistakable sense of being watched. Some hikers speak of a low hum carried on the wind, a vibration that seems to nestle in the bones and stay there long after the sound has passed. Others claim to see tiny glimmers in the fog at night, like the moonlight is catching on glass hidden in the mist. And a few, the ones who linger too long, say they catch movement in the monastery's black windows, a suggestion of a pale, featureless face observing from the shadows. Locals still pass down the warning whispered for generations. Do not look at the hill. Do not follow the hum. And never ever let them see your eyes. Because the monastery has never cared for gold. It has never asked for bread or prayer. It only takes the one thing that will let it see forever. And perhaps, if you've listened this far, you've already felt it. The prickling sense that something is watching you now, even in the safety of your home. Maybe it's just the story taking root in your imagination. Or maybe the monastery never needed you to stand on its hill to notice you. If tales like this haunt you long after they end, if you feel the pull of dark history and the forbidden corners of our world, then step closer to the shadows with us. This is the Macabre Record, where the most unsettling legends and buried horrors live on in whispers. Subscribe, and the next story will find you. But remember, once you've seen it, it has already seen you.